There's so much you can do. Either you have a good silage safety management program, or you have excuses when somebody gets injured or killed. It's one or the other. You really don't have both.
Welcome to this new season of Rumination, the podcast that discusses key topics with leading industry influencers in the North American dairy and cattle industries. I'm happy to be back hosting this podcast for the 5th season. This year, we're expanding the range of topics discussed in the podcast by adding 2 co-hosts. I will giving up some of my hosting duties on some episodes to my colleagues Vicky Brisson and Dr. Greg Eckerle. A little background about my co-hosts. Vicky Brisson completed her Bachelor's of Science in Animal Science at the University of Guelph in 2019. She also holds a Master's of Science from Guelph, where her research focused on mathematical modeling of B vitamins in dairy cows. She joined Jefo almost 2 years ago and is the Ruminant Technical Service Manager. You can hear her as one of my guests on the last episode of Season 4, Youth in Agriculture, the Future of Food. Our second co-host this year is Dr. Greg Eckerle, a graduate of Kansas State University. Greg's primary focus and expertise is in the beef cattle industry, working to formulate diets and best management practices. Greg now covers all of North America with technical and sales responsibilities for Jefo's feedlot and cattle solutions. I'm very happy and excited about this new season, and I want to thank you, the audience, for your loyal and tuning in to our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform to make sure that you don't miss anything. Episodes will be released every 2 weeks. And now back to our regular program. Today I'm talking with Doug DeGroff of Diversified Dairy Solutions, LLC, a dairy nutrition and management consulting firm based in the Central Valley of California. Our topic today is the importance of safety in silage management. Doug was raised in a large dairy community in upstate New York. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Cornell in dairy science in 1996. And while at Cornell, Doug was a member of both the Dairy Fellows Program and the Farm Credit Fellows Program. After graduation, Doug relocated to California, where he entered the dairy industry in sales and marketing with Monsanto. And in 2001, he spent a year managing a large dairy outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then returned to California in 2002 to work as a dairy nutritionist with Cargill. In 2007, Doug started his own company, Diversified Dairy Solutions, LLC. Doug has been a dairy nutrition consultant for more than 19 years and currently works with 25 dairies, all in the Central Valley of California. Doug keeps busy volunteering with his church, is president of the school board, and serves on the Make-A-Wish Foundation Advisory Board. Doug also enjoys spending any free time he can with his family. Doug and his wife Allison and their 3 children, Drew, Luke, and McKenna, live on an almond and pistachio farm in Tulare, California. Doug is what one would call an expert and advocate in silage safety, as he himself is a silage pile avalanche survivor. It's on this subject, the importance of safety in silage management, that we will discuss today on the Rumination podcast. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Chris, thanks for having me. Appreciate the invite.
Well, it's a real pleasure and ours, and thank you for the opportunity to share your message. So, Doug, with that in mind, could you share with the audience your story of how and why the advocacy for safety related to silage management has become so important to you both personally and professionally?
Sure. It's because I am a silage avalanche survivor that is near and dear to my heart, right? I was young and quite confident, and with an attitude of it can't happen to me. But that my luck ran out on August 27th, 2009, while taking a silage sample that I'd done thousands of times, and from piles that were not as safe as this particular pile, Chris. This pile actually was mechanically shaven. It looked pretty good. Walked up, did my thing, and just as I was finishing up, 20 tons of corn salad came down. not all fell on top of me, of course, but enough came on top of me. The point of which, when the sun went out, I knew what was happening. The silage avalanche doesn't make any sound until it hits the ground, right? And so the only way that I knew something was going to happen is the sun went out. And in a split second, I'm on the ground and thinking, I don't want to die here today. Thankfully, a feeder was there. He pulled me away out of the pile, much like you would pull a calf. And I got up and immediately had pain in my back, but was able to walk around, move everything. And I felt bad for the dairy producer. I felt bad for the owner that I, myself, the nutritionist, got hurt on his dairy, right? And he offered to take me to the hospital, and I said, no, I'm fine. Proceeded to get in my truck, reach across to get my seatbelt, and at that point, I felt an incredibly sharp and intense pain. I called my wife, told her to meet me at the ER here in the town, and they diagnosed me with 2 broken vertebrae and some torn ligaments. Fortunately, that's all it was. There was no injury to my spinal cord, no injury to anything else, no other broken bones, just 2 vertebrae that I wore a back brace, a turtle shell for about 60 days. I did exactly what the doctors, and after I got the turtle shell off, the physical therapist. So I'm a fortunate one in the sense that what I am taking with my experience is the opportunity to share with you that it could have been 1,000 times worse. My wife, at the time we were pregnant, we didn't know we were pregnant, right? So we had 2 young boys, and had I perished in that pile that day, I would have left a widow wife with who was pregnant. So that hits pretty close to home. So so that's what happened to me. That's my story. And probably I'm most interested in it because I'm the person who said, I'm fast enough, I'm quick enough, I'm probably arrogant enough, right, to say it's not going to happen to me. And it did. And I fortunately learned a lot from it, and forever changed in a good way, not forever changed in a tragic way.
I look forward to discussing this a bit more and what we can do, because guess what I was doing last Friday, right? And so, because they look so safe, right? And I just need that little sample. Yeah. So I really appreciate your openness, and can't imagine the other pain, the mental pain, how that must have really scared you. And your first attempt next time to try and work with someone to get silage samples would be, well, life changing, right? So I appreciate that openness and candor. So speaking of that, I mean, when we talk about safety, let's talk about those working in and around silage. So what are some of the key points in the silage safety that you feel is extremely important to share from the perspective of those people working in and around silage on a daily basis, or even infrequently?
So I think the first thing is, I'd like to say, it can happen to you, or it could happen to your dairy or your feedlot, right? It can happen to you, right? You first got to accept that. No matter how many years you've been doing it, how safe you are, right? It can happen. And so once you know that, then you have to be intentional about it, right? You have to, if you're a dairy owner, a feedlot owner, right? You have an obligation. I use that word pretty aggressively. That you have an obligation to those people who work on your business, who are going to be around that silage, whether they are a full-time employee, a contract employee, maybe a silage harvester, or your nutritionist, or feed salespeople, right? Anybody who's around your pile, and including innocent bystanders. There's stories of kids riding on the cement slabs with their bicycles, right? Where they don't know, there's no equipment running around. And so they're riding their bicycles, where they have tragically been killed by silage avalanches. So you have an obligation as an owner to do all that you can for a variety of reasons. One, to protect the people around, but also to protect your business, right? Somebody gets seriously hurt or injured on your dairy, or I'm sorry, seriously hurt or tragically killed, it's very bad for your business financially, and I don't need to explain of all the details and consequences that come along with that. So, training, talking to your employees, talking to these people that are going to be around your silage piles, hanging up, putting up signs. There's so much you can do, and either you have a good silage safety management program, or you have excuses when somebody gets injured or killed. Right? It's one or the other. You really don't have both, right? And trust me when I say you want to have a good silage safety program. So if and when somebody does get hurt, it still could happen, right? But you've done all that you can as an employee, as a business owner, as a manager. You've done all that you could to do, and the event still happened. But if you didn't, you've got a bunch of excuses. And when somebody gets tragically hurt or killed, excuses aren't real good to try to explain to the family, or to explain to authorities, or explain to attorneys, right? So.
Can we talk about what you would define as a good silage safety program?
Sure. It starts with sitting down with the employees and going over the risks of what comes with employees or anybody around the pile, right? So let's start with anybody who's going to be in the feed area, right? So it's not just employees, it's salespeople, it's nutritionists, it's anybody who's going to be in the feed area, and going over the risks, and not just a risk of it avalanching. There's other risks with silage. There's gases, there's
equipment driving around it all the time.
So just become aware and hanging up signs, making danger, keep out, right? In addition to communicating verbally all the risk, danger, keep out. If you're going to be in the feed area, right, at any point in time, have protective vests or clothing that identifies you. Have some standard operating protocols at the time of harvest. For example, you're going to be back there sampling feed. Well, that you have to have a buddy system, somebody who's getting the attention of maybe the packing tractor, so you can go in and you can get that feed sampled, because there's times that you cannot not avoid being sampling the feed, right? But it's, again, open communication of and then signs, and then reviewing these probably before every silage harvest is a minimum. When you have a new employee, which happens all the time, make sure you don't wait until the next training session. They should have a course of what's going on within days of being hired, right? So I call it just being intentional as an owner or as a manager, right? You have to be very intentional on these things, and you have to have certain protocols. And once you develop these things, it really doesn't change from year to year. It doesn't. There's things that can be added. Really, I don't see things that come off the bottom of the list. But once you have it, it's communication, and becomes repetitive. It does, but it can happen to you, is what I like to continue to say.
No, it's a point well taken. So the communication of why it's important, and then the standard procedures that should be implemented to all new employees. So we talked kind of about the farm manager and the owner responsibilities, but talk to me about your interactions with employees when you talk about safety around silage management, and what they need to be thinking about, especially for those listening today that are working on farms and what they need to do differently?
The employees are around it the most, right? They're around, and certain employees are there in front of piles every single day, multiple times a day, right? And they're the people that highest at risk because they have the highest exposure, and so they need to be aware, of course, of what could be happening when they're going up, removing tires or removing plastic. I really like to have I like to encourage the employees and the owners, but it also comes pretty good from if the owners haven't done it, an employee asking for, hey, can you get me a safety harness? Can you get a cable that runs across the length of the pile? And there's 2 stakes. It's incredibly cheap. And the employee or employees, they hook into this 5-point harness to go up to get tires off or to cut plastic, or if you are pitching off. I will not recommend you pitch off bad feed anymore. I just will not do it. I will not take that risk because God forbid somebody gets hurt. I'm the person who gave the recommendation. I didn't tell him to do it, but I gave the recommendation to the owner. Hey, that spoiled feed should be pitched off. I used to do that. I no longer do that. And I don't support that. If in fact you do, if the dairy's done it, that's their decision. It's not a recommendation. It's coming from me. The employee should be in a harness. And the other thing that I like to communicate with employees, Chris, is especially these mechanically shaven piles. You can most mechanically shaven piles are straight up and down. Some are actually concave a little bit. I believe that's it. That's very dangerous, very dangerous. Where it's leaning. Some guys I've got where they've actually got it like this. I'm trying to get the angle right. Where if you were to fall off, it would be next to impossible for you to hit the cement, right? You'd roll down the face of the silage pile. Would you get hurt? Most likely, yes. But would you injure yourself so dearly they would be planning a funeral? Probably not. If you fall off the top of a pile that's straight up and down and you go on the cement, most likely they're going to be planning a funeral for you. So I like to say, hey guys, work hard at trying to angle it. It can be done, and on small piles, on big piles, I've seen it done successfully. And so when you're up there, even if you're in a harness, and of course, if you're that's going to save you from going down. But if you're not in a harness, that's another safety thing. Oh, I'm just going to run up there and grab that real quick. I'm not going to harness up. Well, if you do happen to trip, fall, or an avalanche is down, it's a little bit less of a risk, I'll say.
Minimizing risk. And certainly to your point, we've preached for years to minimize spoilage on the top and on the sides. And there's certainly technology now that successfully does that. And here's one other reason, just to stay off the top doing really somewhat dangerous,
very dangerous
activities on the farm, right? So I appreciate you reminding of this as far as the nutrition community, the watch outs they need to have when they're making recommendations. Doug, tell me, so, your experience, it's obviously traumatic. It was, it harmed you. It's changed how you approach these. So one thing we always challenge with from the nutrition side of the business, and you kind of alluded to it. So, what's your recommendation for safely sampling silage on dairies, on feedlots?
So great question. I'll start off with what I used to do.
Yeah.
And why I did it, and then I'll tell you how stupid. I'll use the word stupid and how bad of an idea it was. Right. So, my opinion: sampling silage from one side of the pile to the other side of the pile is very similar feed. That feed was all brought in at the same time. Right. So if I want to came in from that field, right? So if I sample it over here and I sample it over here, it's going to be a lot of the same way. So I like to sample the pile up and down, right? So I would get in the bucket, the loader of the bucket, and I would be able to communicate enough with the employee that I needed to be up and down, right? And I'm doing more hand gestures than I am doing Spanish, and I'd raise up, because then I get the pile, I get the top of the feed, because that feed is different than this feed down here. And if I went right straight down the middle of the pile, I would get arguably a very good representation of the pile. I'd go from top to bottom, right? And the feeder would put me all the way to the top, and I go all the way straight down. I had a 5-gallon bucket, and I put so many handfuls in every foot to 18 inches. And I got down there and I mixed that feed up, Chris, and then I put it in my bag, and I had an incredibly good representation of the pile. It was probably about as unsafe as you can get, because, at the bottom, the loader backs away, because now I can get it. So I'm standing there for a few minutes, as much as I can reach high and low. So now, same concept. It's important to get a good representation of the pot. If you're not going to get a good sample, I would argue don't waste your time getting a sample at all, right? Because it's no information is better than bad information. So I now have the feeder. All my dairies I work with they're I've been doing it long enough. They know exactly what to do. They'll either face it with a facer, or they'll scrape it, I guess, with a payloader, right? And knock it. And then what they'll do is, I got about half of the guys that will put so much in a feed wagon, mix it up, spit it out. Now that feed is just to clean out what was left over in the mixer wagon. Then we put another 5,000 pounds in it, mix it up, spit it out in a safe place. I get a sample from that. I take my 5-gallon bucket. I get samples from that. I would argue that is the best representation of the pile. It takes 10, 15 minutes to get that sample, but boy, is it good and is it accurate. And they always unload in a spot on the cement that's away from the equipment and away from the face of the pile. So I went from being the most dangerous you could possibly be to now it's the slowest, but the most accurate you can be, and the most safest you can be. And I do wear a vest when I do it, right? And if they don't put it in the mixer wagon, even if they push it over out of the way because it's getting turned, that's pretty good as well, right? But those dairies where I've gotten the habit of doing it, it's just easier to keep up the habit than to change them. So
yeah, no, I appreciate those thoughts, because one, it's important for dairy producers and managers to understand the risk involved for the people on their farm, to make that extra effort to not only be safe, but to get a much better sample. And to your point, because the mixer wagon's always empty, right?
Yeah.
He says sarcastically, but to empty that mixer out with some is a great idea. I mean, that's a great idea, because there's always something in there that's going to interfere with your sample. So just as we're wrapping up, I always like to ask guests, what are some of the key take-homes you'd like to leave the listening audience, the watching audience today, for 3 or 4 key points that you feel are just really important when it comes to safety around silage management?
I would start off with saying the most important part of any silage safety program, or any silage program, is safety.
Okay.
Right? You can tell me that you're using how you're packing your silage, and how you're using this great inoculant, and how you're using this oxygen barrier, and how you got a big old silage cement slab, and you're doing a drive over pile, and you're doing all these things to make better silage. That doesn't matter if you don't have a safety program. So let's first start off with the most important part of any silage program is safety, right? So let's start there. So if a guy's going to brag about how great his program is, and he doesn't use the word safety, he's missing the boat, right? Because he's got, and again, I'll use that word, an obligation to send everyone home safely every day. And that was a quote from the late Dr. Keith Bolson, who was a silage advocate, or silage safety advocate from K-State, and that was a quote that, send everyone home safe every day. So I'll start off with that every great program, you have to have safety in it. Everyone needs to remember it can happen to you or your business, right? even if you have a safety program in place, it doesn't mean that it can't happen. Minimizes your risk, right? But it could happen. You have to be intentional about safety. We don't we don't spend enough time on safety, right? Until something happens, and maybe it happens at the neighbor, right? But boy, it gets our attention, and boy, we better do something. We better have a safety meeting, right? But safe. There's nothing real sexy about safety, right? It's so necessary, and we just have to keep that in mind. And I'll digress here just for a second, Chris. Here in the States, right? When I was a kid, nobody wore their seatbelt. Growing up in upstate New York, nobody wore their seatbelt. It was just normal not to do it. Fast forward 30 years later, at least here in California, everybody wears their seatbelt. There's very few people that I know that do not wear their seatbelt. It's just a habit, right? So we went from nobody wearing their seatbelt 30 years ago to now it's a must. And it's not just because of the ticket or it's a law. It's the right thing to do, right? And I look at silage safety as something similar. You just have to get where it's part that the normal, then it becomes normal. We're talking about safety. We're doing safety protocols. We're reminded of safety on a weekly or a monthly basis.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate those sage words and advice. Doug, it's been a real pleasure to meet and discuss with you on this topic. And thank you for sharing with our audience and for your commitment to share your knowledge and experience to improve farm safety and to prevent injuries and to stop future tragedies.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And I commend you, Chris, and Jefo for doing these types of things. And it's a constant reminder, and it changes behavior. So
I surely want to thank our audience for listening to us today, and I'll remind you that you can subscribe to our channel at jefo.ca so that you don't miss our next episode of Jefo's Rumination Podcast. You can also find us at, again, jefo.ca on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo, precision nutrition for a growing world. Have a great day.